So with that, we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Office of the Chief Scientist Science Seminar Series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Vanessa Stralberg. I'm a Senior Science Advisor with the OCS and your host for this winter's seminar series. On behalf of our entire team, welcome to today's event. I would like to start today by respectfully acknowledging that in Alberta, we are on the traditional gathering places and home to the peoples of Treaty 4, Treaty 6, Treaty 7, Treaty 8, Treaty 10, and the Métis Nation. I would like to acknowledge the diverse Indigenous people whose footsteps have shaped this territory and whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our communities today. Wherever you find yourself, I encourage you to recognize and acknowledge the relationship that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis have with the land upon which we all live, work, and learn. And with that, and in the keeping of tradition of gathering, these science seminars provide us an opportunity to get together, to exchange knowledge on interesting science happening across our province in an open learning and sharing environment. The hope is that through our dialogue today, we are all able to improve our awareness and understanding and to put this new knowledge into practice, supporting evidence-informed decision-making wherever that occurs. As you may have noticed when you joined the call, we're recording today's seminar. Your microphone and video are disabled. However, you can enter your questions or comments at any time during or after the presentation via the chat. The chat will not be recorded. Once the presentation has concluded, I will read out those questions in the order that they were received. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Today, we are welcoming Dr. Deanna Stralberg, who is presenting on modeling and mapping refugia from wildfire across Western Canada. Dr. Deanna Stralberg is a research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service in Edmonton and an adjunct professor in the Department of Renewable Resources at the University of Alberta. Her research focuses on climate change refugia, drought and wildfire vulnerability, and the development of spatial tools to support climate-informed conservation and forest management. A landscape ecologist by training, Deanna integrates remote sensing, ecological modeling, and field studies to identify areas of landscape most likely to sustain biodiversity and ecosystem function under future climate conditions. So with that, I'm going to pass the floor over to Deanna. Welcome.
All right. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that introduction. I did change my title just a wee bit, but the idea is the same. And so I'd like to start by just acknowledging my collaborators, contributors here at CFS, as well as my collaborators with the governments of BC and Northwest Territories for some of the work that I'll show. And I'd especially like to thank Christine Kunzman, who is leading the modeling work for this project and has really contributed a lot. So let's hope that my slide advancing works. It's maybe a little bit slow. Okay. There we go. Okay. So just a bit of an overview of the project. So I'm going to talk about a project that's aimed at mapping fire refugia. Fire refugia are areas that are less likely to burn in Western Canada. But to get us there, I really want to talk a little bit about the climate change context and why fire refugia are important. So wildfire, of course, is a natural part of boreal ecosystems, but under climate change, it's increasingly acting as a catalyst for rapid ecosystem change. And maybe because I'm a landscape ecologist, I think a lot about landscape heterogeneity and how that can promote refugia from climate change. And fire refugia are a big component of that in fire-prone systems. So in Alberta, I think it's especially important to recognize that we're in a part of the country where moisture availability limits the distribution and productivity of forests. The Climate Moisture Index, or CMI, is a simple representation of water availability. It's calculated as the difference in millimeters between annual precipitation and potential evapotranspiration or heat. And when CMI is positive, there's a moisture surplus and trees can grow. When it's negative, we have a moisture deficit and trees often struggle. Over the long term, trees generally do not grow naturally if CMI is consistently negative. Here in Edmonton, CMI is approximately 0. We're right on the cusp between moisture surplus and moisture deficit. So we have a transitional aspen parkland ecosystem with spruce mostly occurring on north-facing slopes where incoming radiation is reduced. And this photo on the upper right shows this a little south of here with an example from the Red Deer River near Tolman. And in addition to this large aspen parkland region, there are other interior regions in Canada with dry climates that experience moisture deficits. In areas like BC and the Yukon, elevation and topography play a big role in determining moisture availability. We can zoom in a little bit here on Alberta, which is in the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains and influenced by continental climate conditions, and look at how in the recent years, as the climate has warmed, moisture deficits have increased especially much in Alberta. And by the end of the century, high-end climate models project a much larger area of moisture deficit. And so this will have implications for forest persistence as well as wildfire risk. And so if we connect climate projections to the forest ecosystems that they support, we can start to project future changes in forest suitability. So I'm showing two map sequences here that show how ecoregional climate conditions are projected to shift northward as the climate warms. On the left is an analysis that I did using North American level 3 ecoregions, and on the right is an Alberta-focused analysis led by Rick Schneider using natural subregions. In both maps, boreal ecoregions are mapped in green and light blue colors, and prairie grassland ecoregions are in brown colors, and in the Alberta map also in orange and yellow. So they're both suggesting that grassland climates will creep northward into the boreal zone in Western Canada, and the boreal climates will shift northward and potentially upslope in the future. There's a lot of different studies that have shown similar things. And at the same time, we know that warmer, drier conditions and longer growing seasons are also resulting in increased fire activity. So in the last 50 years, Alberta has seen an increase in total area burned, shown here on the left, as well as median fire severity and total reburn area. And this has corresponded with an increase in vapor pressure deficit, or VPD, which is the difference between the amount of moisture in the air and how much moisture the air can hold. And you can see in the map that in 2023, the VPD anomalies were quite high, and that was the year that was by far Canada's worst fire season, and also for Alberta. So the area burned in Alberta was, I'm plotting it here on the log scale for the area burned graph. So basically there is a relationship here with vapor pressure deficit, dryness, and fire. So if we look at these two circumstances combined, we see a high potential for change. And so warmer and drier climates, when catalyzed by frequent disturbance, can lead to ecosystem transitions from one state to another. So in the last 10 years or so, there have been several modeling efforts for Alberta that have simulated the future interplay between climate and disturbance. The graph on the left is from a paper that I led, and it combined fire growth models with burn P3 with bioclimatic ecosite models. And so it just depicts the changes in a combination of pure conifer, deciduous, and mixed wood stands, as well as treeless or grassland areas. And the beige lines show climate-driven responses, which are pretty extreme, and then the green and blue are fire-mediated under different fire regime assumptions. Then other modeling efforts, like the one on the right, are using forest dynamics models, which can also consider succession and growth, as well as harvest. And so these simulations yielded similar results, a little less dramatic, a little less extreme, but the magnitude of change is kind of broadly similar for the high-end scenario, and other studies have produced similar results. So we're starting to get some kind of multi-model agreement on near-term conifer declines. It's just kind of a matter of how long and how fast it would happen, and to what extent these effects might be buffered by landscape features like peatlands, for example. And at the same time, we've also started to see more evidence on the ground from field studies of directional change in forest cover. So it's been initiated mostly by fire, but also things like permafrost thaw in the north. So it's still an active area of study, of research. On the left are results from a remote sensing paper that covers the Northwest Boreal region, which shows a decline in evergreen forests and increases in pretty much everything else, but especially shrub cover in the north. And on the right are results from a meta-analysis of field-based post-fire regeneration studies throughout Canada, and it was focused on black spruce. And black spruce showed regeneration failures of about 20% in the Western Boreal Plains, and transition to either jack pine or aspen at about 40% of the sites. So we're definitely seeing some signals of failed regeneration and state changes, but it's really still pretty patchy in an active area of research. And also, there's a reason probably you're not seeing such extensive change, and that's the fact that the landscapes are heterogeneous to various extents, of course, but with lots of variation in the potential for resistance and resilience to climate change. So some areas may be naturally buffered from the effects of climate change, either because they're cooler and wetter than their surroundings, or because they're less likely to be influenced by disturbance. So I just want to take a moment to define the concept of climate change refugia. It's a lot of what my research is focused on. These are defined as areas that are relatively buffered from the effects of contemporary climate change, and we can refer to them as climate change slow lanes. The term is borrowed from the field of paleoecology, where it's been used to refer to the places where one or more species persisted through major climatic changes, like the ice ages in the past. And so there's been a couple special issues on this topic recently. One is in the Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment, one in Conservation Science and Practice, which I'm showing here with the QR codes. These journals are pretty geared towards science practitioners and managers, so I definitely encourage you to check them out. But just to go back to the term of refugia, it's pretty broad, and that's kind of what we focused on in the 2020 paper is defining the scope. It can really include large long-term macro-refugia where ecosystems are maintained over large areas and long time periods, for example, northern parts of a species range. It can also refer to localized micro-refugia where conditions are sufficiently decoupled from surrounding regional climates. For example, a north-facing slope or a lake shore that's cooled by lake breezes. And then even on a shorter time scale, temporary refuge from disturbance or even safe haven from predators can be kind of considered part of this climate change refugia continuum. So for management purposes, we tend to think in this decadal to century time scale, local to landscape. And at those scales, disturbance processes are really important for determining how ecosystems respond to climate change and how they transition or persist. So talking first about the broad scale, so macrorefugia depend on individual species climate requirements or niches. So niche models, also known as bioclimatic models, can be useful to give us a sense of broad scale persistence. And so this is an example for the white spruce, which has a broad boreal range shown in the inset map. A bioclimatic model was developed by some of my colleagues here at CFS to project its distribution in future warmer climates. The areas in the main map that are in darker blue are likely to remain suitable for white spruce in the future, while green areas have lower persistent probability, and which varies across different global climate models or GCMs. And the yellow areas are those that are not projected to remain suitable into the 2080s, according to any of the GCMs. So you can see a contraction pattern that resembles that climate moisture index map that I showed in the beginning. And large areas of Alberta and the Northwest Territories also have some uncertainty about long-term persistence. It's only at this scale, the higher elevations and higher latitudes, that's more secure. But these maps were based on pretty coarse climate data, which don't capture the effects of local topography, hydrology, major water bodies, which all can influence responses to climate change. And so these are what we refer to as microrefugia, these areas of local decoupling. And so this is another figure from a 2020 paper in the special issue that I referred to. And we defined kind of two broad categories of refugia, refugia that are based on climatic buffering and those that involve disturbance avoidance. And so climatic buffering represents a direct modification of local climates and can be either terrain mediated or regulated by internal ecological mechanisms. Examples would be like north-facing slopes, steep canyons, peatlands due to the role of sphagnum and other mosses in retaining moisture could be examples of ecosystem protected climatic buffering. So a lot of my research is actually focused in this area, but today I'm going to focus on disturbance avoidance. And the idea is that ecosystem inertia tends to maintain forest ecosystems until change is catalyzed by disturbance. And so areas that are less likely to be affected by fire are called fire refugia, and they can also be either terrain mediated, such as like islands and lakes, or they can be ecosystem protected, such as peatlands that burn at lower severity. So getting into the main topic then of the talk, the concept of fire refugia has been around for a while. It was more formally defined probably about 10 years ago. I'm showing some definitions here. It has various definitions that are kind of similar. They've been referred to as fire islands, shadows, skips, residuals, fire remnants. But the definitions are all kind of centered on the notion that some locations and landscape elements are less likely to burn or less likely to be affected by fire. And a New York Times article on the topic from a couple of years ago referred to fire refugia as lifeboats for forest species. In our particular work, we've defined fire refugia as the patches of vegetation within fire perimeters that survived a burn. So they're a bit defined in relationship to an actual fire, in contrast with the rest of the landscape that didn't experience fire at all. So fire refugia matter because they maintain habitat, support connectivity, and can provide seed sources for recovery, especially as we see increased fire severity and shorter reburn intervals that could potentially kill off seed sources. So the next question is, can we predict where refugia occur and why? And so this work that I'm going to talk about is led by Christine Kunzmann, who's an analyst here at CFS. She started her for her MSc work that started in 2020. She focused on fire refugia, and we've continued that work since she's started as an employee here at CFS. So the objectives of the project are to determine the main drivers of refugia across different ecosystems and fire regimes, to predict where fire refugia are likely to occur under different climate and fuel conditions, and to identify persistent refugia and management co-benefits, including, for example, wildlife habitat. So just to kind of talk about what we know about potential drivers of fire refugia, they have been looked at in many parts of the US, and there's been some work in the Rocky Mountains of Alberta as well that have been important in shaping our understanding. And so we were interested in evaluating the extent to which fire refugia were determined by bottom-up factors, fuels and terrain, versus top-down factors, so climate and fire weather. From a bottom-up perspective, we know that topography can promote fire skips and that wetlands can create fuel breaks and reduce burn severity, especially where there's standing water, whereas fuels or vegetation affect landscape flammability. And then as far as top-down factors go, climate and fire weather do affect fire ignitions, intensity, and spread, as well as fuel dryness. Physical setting is more or less fixed, and so if topography and wetlands are important, then we should be able to predict persistent refugia. Whereas fuels are more ephemeral, but they're still predictable, and in theory we can manipulate them. And if fire refugia are driven by climate, then as climate is changing, there's a lot more things that are out of our control. So it kind of matters not only from an understanding, but also from a management and adaptation perspective. So our study area has grown to include most of Western Canada. It's defined by the Canadian Fire Regime Zonation System. Fire regime units were mapped in this system as areas of somewhat homogeneous fire regime characteristics, so fire frequency, size, seasonality, and ignition cause. And this is the map shown from that paper up in the upper right. The main map here shows the regions that we have modeled so far. And as I mentioned, the work started in Alberta with Christine's MSc thesis, and it was part of a larger NSERC-funded project focused on refugia more broadly. And it was the research questions were focused on the influence of peatlands in the formation of fire refugia. So she found that not only were peatlands less likely to burn, but they influenced fire refugia in the surrounding upland landscape. The models that she used, though, were generalized linear models, and so they were good for inference, but for prediction, they were not very detailed. So we knew that we wanted to eventually redo these models. But also at the time, we'd started working with a group of planners within the BC government who were interested in extending this work to BC. We started with the Okanagan, and then we developed a semi-automated workflow that allowed us to cover much larger areas. So we focused on high-resolution inputs that could be obtained through Google Earth Engine, and we used machine learning through boosted regression trees to improve the prediction power of the models. We were interested in evaluating a larger group of predictors in order to characterize the drivers of refugia more broadly. Results varied by fire regime unit, since BC is such a diverse province, but overall, bottom-up controls were generally strongest. fuels were of highest importance in hotter, drier, flatter regions, whereas physical setting and terrain was of highest importance in cooler, wetter, and more mountainous regions. We did find that bottom-up controls can be overwhelmed by extreme climate, so we did generally predict more refugia in cooler, wetter conditions. And we also compared fire refugia predictions with mapped old-growth forest data to determine the extent to which fire refugia are predictable and persistent. We found pretty good correspondence in most areas, but the results were a bit mixed. Some of that might be due to the quality of the map data. I can talk more about that afterwards if there's interest. But moving on, we also began working with planners and biologists at the government of the Northwest Territories who were interested in fire refugia for a variety of reasons, but they were especially interested in how it could inform caribou conservation. So we developed a study area based on caribou ranges, both boreal and barren ground actually. And we structured our study still around fire regime units. So we ended up covering almost all of the forested region in northwestern Canada, including most of the Yukon and Northwest Territories, and then also parts of Nunavut, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. We couldn't model alpine or Arctic regions because there weren't enough fires to develop good models there, but we took this opportunity to expand our set of predictor variables to include the latest forest attributes mapping for Canada. It's a product called SCANFI based on the National Forest Inventory, as well as a new daily fire weather data set that we hoped would improve predictions, as we previously had just been using climate normals and annual anomalies. The improved forest attributes were very helpful, but the daily fire weather didn't add as much as we had expected. This work is going on and it's ongoing, and I'll summarize some of our caribou-focused analysis in just a bit. But that brings me back to Alberta, where we've been working for the last few months to generate new models that include all of the improvements that we made for BC, as well as the North. So we're kind of iterating through and making improvements every time. The results I'm presenting today are actually pretty hot off the press, and it's the first time we're sharing them broadly. But we have iterated, this is version 2, so we're hoping that it's pretty close to the final version. So our methods have been evolving, but from the beginning, we have used fire severity metrics to identify refugia, fire refugia. Fire severity is the degree to which a site is ecologically impacted by fire, and it includes indicators like vegetation mortality and soil loss. So this is different from intensity, which describes the heat and the speed of fire. It's basically an ecological rather than physical metric. So fire severity is often assessed in the field using something called the Composite Burn Index, or CBI. It's a score that ranges from 0 to 3, and it's based on a combination of vegetation and soil indicators. And it can also be measured with remote sensing by comparing pre- and post-fire satellite imagery with a vegetation index. And there's several that can be used. A common one is the difference normalized burn ratio, which includes spectral reflectance values from both near infrared and shortwave infrared bands. The latter, which is pretty good for detecting differences in moisture content. So DNBR gives you a measure of how much a forest stand has changed following a fire. Refugia occur where CBI is 0 or DNBR values are low. And the site shown here is basically a mid-severity site. So for this particular work, we use fire severity classes that are mapped with satellite imagery as inputs to our models. This is a CFS product in preparation, and field collected CBI data were used to train the models that were built, that were based on then mapped fire severity and a variety of pre-fire forest conditions to then predict a severity class. So from the resulting severity classes, we identified 0 values as refugia, as well as the unmapped donut holes in mapped fire perimeters from a product we called MBAC. It's a CFS fire mapping product. So this is how we defined refugia. And then we sampled fires in our study area. We used the period between 2002 and 2021. We found more issues with older fires, so we kept it a little bit more recent, with each sample location assigned a 0 or a 1, depending on whether it had been mapped as a fire refugium. So notably, we focused on fires greater than 500 hectares, which is pretty large, since our fire weather inputs were restricted to fires of this size. This is quite a bit bigger than what was used in the first iteration, which was 200 hectares, or in British Columbia, where we looked at 130 hectares and greater. But it's smaller than what we used in the Northwest Territories. So we used 3 groups of potential predictors: physical setting, vegetation, and climate, all of which were obtained through, actually this time they were not all obtained through Google Earth Engine, but most of them were. So physical setting and fuels are considered bottom-up controls, while climate is top-down. Physical setting included a variety of topographic and soil metrics, as well as surrounding wetlands and open water. Vegetation metrics were from a Canadian, this remotely sensed forest inventory product that I mentioned, and it includes various metrics describing the composition and structure of the surrounding forest. These were all landscape metrics. So we included information also on recent disturbances. There's a different CFS product that maps cut blocks, insect outbreaks, and fire. And we also included some key climate and weather variables, both long-term averages and annual anomalies, as well as those daily fire weather indices and the date of burn. So we put these all into machine learning models that can handle complex variable interactions and nonlinear responses. I know it's a lot of detail. I've put the resolution and the sources of the data at the bottom if anybody's interested. And because we expected that the drivers of fire refugia would vary across geographies and fire regimes, we developed separate models for each fire regime unit, or at least for the larger ones. Some of the smaller ones we did group to include more individual fires in each sample. But you can see that in general, we had very large data sets. And now I'm showing on this map what we've modeled so far in Alberta, which includes also those FRUs, fire regime units 31, 32, and 26, which were modeled previously with the northern regions. So getting into some of the results, I'm showing variable importance results for 3 of the fire regime units that we modeled: the boreal shield on the left, western boreal plain in the middle, and boreal foothills. So across the board, we found that bottom-up factors, terrain and fuels, were much more important than top-down controls, climate and fire weather. We were a little surprised, especially by the fact that daily fire weather played a pretty small role, but this is consistent with what we found farther north. Terrain variables were most important in the boreal shield, but everywhere else, including the FRUs that I'm not showing, fuels were most important. So the largest portion was explained by forest composition variables, labeled here as vegetation in green. Disturbance variables like cut blocks, fire, and insects are shown in different colors. They were also important, but they were probably superseded by the more specific vegetation data that we had as inputs. We did see a very strong influence of wetlands across the board, but more so in the shield and plain regions, less so in foothills and mountains, where they're not as common. So with respect to individual variables, results varied by ecoregion, but there were a few variables that stood out as being important across the board. For example, canopy closure within a 300-meter radius had a consistently negative effect, as did topographic position index, meaning that valley bottoms and lower slopes were more likely to be refugia than ridges and upper slopes. Several wetland variables showed up in multiple models, including upland proportion, which is the inverse of wetland proportion, as well as poor fen proportion. These are all surrounding landscape variables. The proportion of deciduous forest, pine, and non-pine conifers were important across the board as well. And so these are partial dependence plots. I realize there's a lot going on here, but I wanted to have the opportunity to show you the relationship between fire refugia probability on the y-axis and some of the top predictor variables. Each line represents a different region. So that's why, they each are different models. On the top are vegetation variables, on the bottom are wetland variables. And so since it's a lot of information, I'm just going to highlight a couple. First, looking at canopy closure, you can see that it has a strongly negative effect pretty much across the board, whereas deciduous proportion has a pretty strong positive influence, as we know that deciduous forests tend to be less likely to burn. We did, interestingly enough, in the Western Boreal Plains, in that orange line, find less of an effect, maybe just because it's so ubiquitous and it's stopping fire rather than producing refugia. But in terms of wetlands, we found that poor fens have a strong positive influence in all the regions where they're common. Bogs, on the other hand, had a more negative influence, likely due to the general lack of standing water and abundance of flammable black spruce biomass. But overall, wetlands were, the effects of wetlands, other types of wetlands as well, was generally positive. And the effects of topography and climate are a little less clear-cut, but I'll highlight a few variables here. So again, the effects of topographic position were pretty strongly negative, with valley bottoms more likely to be refugia. Lake distance was not as important as we thought, but in the boreal shield, where there are more lakes, there was a negative effect, meaning that lake shores were more likely to be refugia. Other places, it seemed a bit confounded with other variables. In terms of climate variables, we actually saw higher refugia probabilities at both the higher and lower end of climate moisture and VPD variables. It's clear how wetter conditions may result in more refugia, but also when it's hot and dry and there are bigger fires moving through, they might move through fuels that don't normally burn, so there's just more opportunities to leave refugia. So even though hotter and drier conditions are bad for fire overall, they do still leave more predictable patterns of refugia. So it's a little difficult to interpret the graphs. Okay, so here are the combined maps for our predictions. I'm showing a mid-season date with median fire weather and climate variables. I'm not showing extreme climate or weather conditions because they didn't look noticeably different. There's some small differences. We included here in the map the northern regions that were modeled with the Northwest Territories, so it's more seamless. Prairie regions are so far excluded, and in other areas in white were those that are masked out because they're either urban, agricultural, or unvegetated. On the left are predictions from the full model using 2024 fuels. You can see that the individual recent fires show up in dark blue because they have decreased fuel loads. So we can consider those short-term or ephemeral refugia. The fires, you don't particularly need our models to identify, but there's a lot else that's going on in these maps. And so we created another set of maps that are predictions where fuels are held constant. And these are what we're referring to as persistent refugia. So these are basically fuels held constant at average conditions. So these are areas that may have high refugia potential based on physical setting, topography, wetlands, and open water in particular. And then in this next set of maps, I'm showing the same fuel-based and persistent refugia predictions, but for the early season. So this is based on May 23rd. We thought it would be more important because so much of Alberta's fire season is early and some of it's before green up. We didn't see really different patterns, but we did see that refugia probability was generally higher in the early season compared to the mid-season there. And this is just probably reflecting the additional water on the landscape at that time, especially in lowland areas. And it's also a bit cooler. So taking that fuel-based map and zooming into a place southwest of Fort Mac here, we can look at the predictions more closely and see how they line up with different variables. And so looking at the area around the star in the upper right, you can see that the high refugia values in the northeast portion are driven by recent fires, which are shown in red on this map. Looking at the other star in the center bottom, you can see that other areas of higher refugia line up pretty closely with surrounding poor fen proportions shown in red. I'll just flip back and forth. But of course, these maps show variables that went into the model, so it's not surprising that they line up. A better test of model accuracy is to predict it into fire years that were not included in the model, which is what we did. So we did that for 2022, 23, and 24. And overall, the model performance was quite good, with fire refugia predicted much better than expected at random, except for the southern boreal plains in 2022. But for everywhere else, they did really well. Here I'm showing 3 example fires, one for each year, and I'm showing the version with fuels held constant just because we didn't have the opportunity yet to make all the fuel-based maps that match individual years. but we did use those conditions for the validation statistics. So looking first at the 2022 fire on the left, the fire perimeter is mapped onto the fire refugia predictions, with blue and dark green having higher refugia probability. And it's clear that in some places the expected refugia might have slowed or stopped the fire. So you can see the perimeters lining up with refugia. If we now overlay fire severity classes, you can see that most of it burned at high severity in red there, and the light blue areas are refugia. If you look at the star, you can see that the predicted refugia line up with the actual refugia pretty well. Turning to the 2023 fire in the middle near Fort Chip, there's a lot fewer predicted refugia. This is on the shield, and they're just generally fewer refugia, and they don't coincide with the perimeters in the same way. But if you overlay the actual fire severity and again focus on that starred location, you can see that there's some general correspondence between the predicted and actual refugia, even though they're pretty small. And then finally, for the third 2024 fire, you can see the perimeter effects again, and focusing on that starred area in the bottom right, you see that predicted and actual refugia do tend to coincide. So summarizing so far our findings in Alberta, we found, as we did elsewhere in Western Canada, that bottom-up factors like physical setting and fuels were the best predictors of mapped fire refugia. Fuels especially canopy closure and deciduous proportion were most important, although they varied in strength across the province. With respect to physical setting, peatlands, especially fens and mineral wetlands, drove refugia patterns in boreal shield and plain regions. Not so much in foothills and mountains, but it suggests that fire refugia will continue to be predictable in a warmer climate, just because, the top-down factors were less important. So that suggests that fire refugia will continue to be predictable in a warmer climate. This doesn't mean that fire refugia won't burn under extreme weather conditions. It is a real concern. It just means that the locations of fire refugia will have a lot more to do with fuels and terrain than climate or weather. So as I mentioned, the predictions that I've been showing you are quite new, so we've only just gotten to the validation stage. But we'd also like to evaluate how fire refugia may coincide with other values on the landscape, for example, wildlife habitat. In the Northwest Territories, we have been working with the government of the Northwest Territories Environment and Climate Change Ministry to compare our predictions with caribou habitat. It's still preliminary, but we're using RSFs, resource selection function models, that were developed from caribou location data. And we conducted an analysis to see when and if high quality caribou habitat was associated with areas of high fire refugia probability. We found that in the late winter season, shown in blue, and in the calving season, shown in light green, there was a reasonably strong association. We did find that areas strongly selected by boreal caribou were a lot more likely to also be predicted fire refugia, but this is mostly explained by the caribou use of peatlands during those seasons in this area. So, in areas without a lot of peatlands or with different habitat associations, the results might be different. And also, well, the other thing is that we didn't look at the extent to which caribou are using actual fire refugia. This is predicted fire refugia, so it's more about the habitat characteristics of fire refugia rather than their actual use of skips. And in this region, we're also summarizing fire refugia by range planning region, as well as by existing and proposed protected areas to inform planning priorities. So in Alberta, we still have plenty of work to do, but we're committed to sharing the model predictions publicly as soon as we've done adequate internal review. So you can find our maps online in separate Google Earth Engine viewers. This is here a screen snapshot of the one that Christine developed for Alberta and adjacent fire regime units. You can select which version of the predictions you'd like to view, early or late, persistent or fuel-based, extreme or median fire weather. I've included a URL and QR code here, and maybe it can be the link can be included in the chat so that you can explore the app on your own by zooming into areas of particular interest. It's at 120-meter resolution. You'll notice that northwestern Alberta is missing from this map, but you can find it in the viewer that we created for adjacent northern regions. So here is that map for the Northwest Territories and adjacent regions with a QR code as well. And they cross-reference back to each other. I would note that we're running new models again for these regions. And this is mostly to incorporate the new fire weather and, more importantly, the newer vegetation variables that we just recently obtained access to. But you can still download the current rasters. They probably won't change a whole lot. And so we've made those layers available. And here's the map for the BC product. This is published and the data are also available for download. We'll do the same eventually pretty soon for Alberta, but we're just not quite there yet. You can definitely email us if you'd like to request the data. Okay, so now what does all this mean for decision making? Well, from a conservation standpoint, we think that fire refugia and associated landscape features like peatlands can help sustain biodiversity and improve forest resilience in a changing climate. Persistent fire refugia in particular can inform long-term conservation priorities in the face of a changing climate. So we suggest that they might be appropriate to consider as conservation objectives in various types of planning efforts, regional, sub-regional planning, for example. From a forest management standpoint, both persistent and fuel-based fire refugia can be used to inform the design and placement of fuel treatments like thinning and prescribed fire. For example, fuel treatments may be more effective when combined with existing fire refugia. So more generally, fire refugia could inform forest planning by suggesting, harvest priorities that reduce fuels in a strategic manner, considering existing fire refugia. And so to close, I'll show you an example of how we've used fire refugia to inform forest landscape planning in British Columbia. This is an example from the Lakes Timber Supply area near Burns Lake in central BC. The work was done by my colleague Doug Lewis, actually. We provided the data, but this was it was profiled in a case study in a recent paper that we wrote on climate-informed landscape planning. So this was part of a forest landscape planning pilot project. It was a group called the Lakes Resiliency Project, and they wanted to consider climate change refugia as part of what they called an ecocultural backbone. The backbone was intended to form the foundation for spatial conservation planning in the Lakes TSA. So to identify climate change refugia, they overlaid various topographic metrics that were intended to represent refugia from drought and heat, things like persistent groundwater, cold air ponding, north-facing slopes, topographic diversity. And then they used our models for fire refugia. And then in this area, the top predictors were topographic position, slope curvature, and slope northness. So they used these predictions to come up with a composite layer and then combined it with other conservation land designations, things like old growth management areas, to create this conservation backbone and also to inform potential retention areas within cut blocks. So this planning work is still ongoing, but it's still relatively new. So we'll hopefully see more results coming out of that. And I'd be really happy to see some of our fire refugia maps used in similar exercises. So with that, I'm going to wrap up with a TLDR summary of some of the key messages that I hope that you might take away with you today. We think that wildfire will accelerate climate-driven landscape changes and can push forward forests to new states. But fire refugia, unburned patches within fires, can play an important role in biodiversity persistence and forest recovery. We found that fire refugia were primarily shaped by fuels and physical setting, including wetlands, which means that they can be predicted and mapped, enabling more informed conservation and forest management decisions. And with that, I'll thank the funders and collaborators that made this work possible, and provide my email as well as that for Christine, so you can contact us with questions. Thanks so much.
Wow, holy Diana, Deanna, that was a huge amount of work. And with that, I'd like to again thank Deanna, sorry, for her really interesting presentation, the scope of which this research was conducted and the amount of links and QR codes that I've been like actively putting on my phone while you're presenting. I'm really excited to pull some more of this up. So thank you for showing us the work that you guys have been doing. I'll thank the audience as well for participating, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all again in the fall.